Hi, everyone. Good to see you all so far. Can we use the chat a little bit? Where's everybody coming in from? I'll start. Oregon. Cool. Yes, Colorado, Boston. Hey, nice. We have a real melange. Diversity of spots. Ooh, Toronto. Awesome. Great to see everyone here. So we're going to give folks a few minutes to get started, but
sounds good.
I'm taking away the precious programming time of all these companies. I'm just seeing the pull request plummet as I have more and more people who join, so that's good.
The pressure's on. We better have something good to say.
This is a very expensive meeting, that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a good message in here somewhere, which is maybe dev velocity could be increased through use of tools. So I hope that's what people take away. But
yeah, that would be a good takeaway.
One thing that's interesting, I think, is, being in the tech community, you think of the Bay Area as having like a lot of companies, but for health, certainly Toronto and New York and Texas also have like a really good representation. So that's exciting too. Ooh, Stephen, that's an interesting take. I'm a non-technical guy who wants to see if I should beat up on my colleagues about using more tools. Well, I can't advocate while being recorded for beating people, but there are always good uses of tools that I think could benefit. Is everybody staying generally healthy? I think there's a kind of set of viruses traversing the community at present.
Yeah, we haven't really seen it too much, and at least in the circle we run in Salt Lake, we've been lucky. Kids are healthy, we're healthy.
Amazing. Okay, well, 104. I think we're gonna take a nod towards getting started. So great to see everyone here. So for those in the kind of audience, I guess, who are not pinned, one thing that you'll note is that this is not a webinar. So you are kind of free to use the chat. And when we get to the question and answer session, to use your own voice to ask questions. This is on purpose. I think we would love to hear from you all about what questions and ideas are top of mind. So please do that while we're, doing the preamble and the discussion, use the chat. And then when we open up for questions, please feel free to use your own voice, and would love to hear from you. But I will start off with a little bit of generally slides, which will be super brief. But we're here today to talk about dev tools and open source in healthcare. And we have perspectives from a really good group. We're all YC alumni, notably, and have like a varied career paths. And companies here, Medplum, Flexpa, and Tuva. So that's one thing that will come up a few times. And before we get started, into the true content of this discussion, I wanted to give us a little bit of a sense here about why we're here today. So composability is to software as compounding interest is to finance. This is a very, didn't make this up. This is kind of a known aspect, which has happened time in other domains and also in healthcare. And effective use of software, provides this more powerful scenario where pieces are composed to build a powerful system quickly and effectively. And a very high percentage of the software in the world is open source, data centers, mobile OS, etc. And, in its origin, open source started as a fringe political movement, but remained a curiosity and has started to grow exponentially. And the real reason behind this is because it really unlocked that power of composability and increases the velocity of those who are trying to build applications. So this is one of the topics that we're going to explore here today as with the panelists, and particularly in healthcare. Healthcare has a bunch of challenges, of course. The composability is especially challenging because of the regulatory landscape. The fact that there's a lot of stakeholders, complex, multifaceted data and other, intrinsic to the domain aspects that make this composability especially challenging. So I'll stop sharing at this instant. And I'd like to warmly welcome our panelists here today who are going to really help us explore this topic. I'll start with Aaron. So Aaron is co-founder and CEO of Tuva Health, and in his past career, Health Catalyst and Colorado Department of Health Policy and Financing, and is a graduate of University of Colorado. So he'll, speak about his experience and his current company. So welcome, Aaron.
Hey.
We have Josh here, who's co-founder and CTO of Flexpa, and he was in the COVID batch of YC and a previous CTO of universe.com, which was acquired by Ticketmaster. So you may or may not know some things about auth. Anyway, we will go into that.
You can blame me. You can blame me for the Taylor Swift disaster.
That's what I was going to.
Oh, great. I mean, we do need someone to blame for that. And he is a longtime open source contributor and enthusiast. And Cody is co-founder and CTO of Medplum, and in his past life was senior director of infra at One Medical. So really super relevant experience. And let's see. What does your company do? And tell us from a developer perspective. I don't want the jargony, we are transforming healthcare through whatever. In the eyes of the dev, tell us what your company does.
Yeah, sure. So our user, so first of all, our company is Tuva Health, and we are the company that's behind the Tuva project, which is open source software for cleaning and transforming healthcare data like claims data, medical record data, et cetera, so that it can be more immediately used for analytics and machine learning. And so our users are really healthcare data teams. These are data engineers, analysts, data scientists that are trying to build data products or do analytics with healthcare data. But it turns out that it's really hard to do analytics with healthcare data because there's two main problems that you encounter if you're working with healthcare data. One problem is you run into a bunch of data quality problems. And the other problem is raw healthcare data doesn't really have any concepts that you need in it, natively in it, to be able to answer very interesting questions. So even basic concepts like, what is an acute inpatient visit? Or does this patient have type 2 diabetes? Or was this particular hospital visit a readmission? Those concepts are nowhere in raw healthcare data. They have to be built on top of it. And so what the Tuva project, what we're building into the Tuva project is basically code that you can run your data through that tests your raw data for all these very common data quality issues and identifies them, and then builds these concepts so that you end up ultimately with a bunch of data that you can use more immediately for answering questions that are important to patient care or delivering care more efficiently, things like that.
Awesome. Oh, it seems very useful. The comparability of health records is obviously a well-trodden problem, and can absolutely see the utility in addressing it. So Josh, you're up next. Developer perspective. What does your company do?
So Flexpa connects to hundreds of health plan payers and makes it really easy to access claims data. So back in 2021, the health plan payers built patient access APIs, but there hasn't been a lot of real world adoption of them. So as a developer, if you want to connect to claims data from United or Humana, you can go sign up for their developer portal, get your client ID and client secret, and create a patient-directed authorization experience for that data. But the prospect of doing that for hundreds of payers basically makes it a non-starter for most teams. So Flexpa connects them all. And instead of exposing some yet another proprietary API, we expose a unified FHIR-based one.
Amazing. I mean, back to the composability, it's like absolutely very clear direct connection there. Okay, Cody, you're up. What does your company do, but from a developer perspective?
Thank you. Medplum is an open source API first EHR development platform. So given that we're speaking to a team of software engineers and software adjacent folks, we sometimes describe it as an open source Firebase, but specifically for healthcare. So some examples would be that we provide an authentication framework for managing your patients, managing your practitioners and clinical users. We provide a clinical data repository, a place where you can actually store all of that clinical healthcare data that you need for both diagnostic purposes or workflow purposes or billing purposes. We provide a React component library for handling many of the common representations of healthcare data that you might need to display in a user interface layer. And we provide automation layers, basically a serverless framework, but that's very healthcare centric and built right into the clinical data repository. And where this gets really interesting, and given that we're talking about composability and standards, is that all of these features have been driven from a very standards centric point of view. So where if you go sign up for Google Firebase tomorrow, you're going to be interacting with many of their kind of standards, their proprietary APIs, their proprietary way of doing things. Our auth is based on Smart on FHIR. Our clinical data repository is a FHIR repository that implements most of the FHIR spec. The React component libraries are all FHIR native in terms of how they pull in that data. Our bot and automation framework is FHIR native as well. So it operates and takes action on FHIR primitives. So we're really trying to take this notion of healthcare standards and creating developer experiences for the developer ecosystem.
I mean, maybe a call out to the crowd here, and feel free to use the chat. Like, what's the general awareness of FHIR, FHIR in this group? People know what it is? Oh no, nobody does? Okay. Well, no. Something, yes. Okay, yeah. All about intro, yeah. So I think good to know. I think there's like, part of the FHIR is a very interesting open source case in and of itself, where there's like many, proprietary standards. I think EDI, for example, is one, and like having an open standard where you can just go and read the implementation. It seems like, all three companies are able to operate more effectively using that standard. So pretty interesting. But okay, Aaron, I'm going to point back to you. I mean, Tuva has a big open source component. Would love for you to comment on why you chose to have that, and what you see the benefit being both for your customers and for yourself.
Yeah. So as Coco and I, my co-founder Coco and I, were like kind of getting into this problem more and figuring out, okay, this is what we're going to build. What's the right way to do it? There was this other thing that has kind of been happening at the same time, and it's been going on for a few years. And it's kind of this revolution of open source data tools that's kind of sweeping through the data community. This is things like DBT for data transformation in a data warehouse, Great Expectations for data quality testing, Airbyte for ETL. And so we looked at the data community, and ourselves included, and we're like, everybody is loving these open source tools and like the ability to like test them and see how they work as an adoption pathway. And we're building the Tuva project on those open source tools, notably DBT right now. And so we just wanted to enable that same kind of developer experience, that open source developer experience for our users that they were already used to kind of from their open source, the more picks and shovels open source tools. So that's the short of it.
I mean, can I drill in one more layer here? Like you mentioned open source developer experience. I imagine there's folks in the audience who, if you've worked in healthcare for a while, you may have never encountered that open source developer experience. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, just the ability. So like to test out to learn about a new tool on like Twitter or at a conference or, talking to a colleague and being able to immediately like go to the open source code base and download it and try it. Like this has been like something that the machine learning community has been used to for a long time because a lot of the machine learning frameworks like scikit-learn or PyTorch are open source, but it started to come to more of like the core data engineering community, like how do we build a data platform and things like that. So I think it's
you mentioned like the access and then that you could kind of teach yourself how it works. Like,
yeah, you can try it out. You can see if it makes sense for you and your team. Every tool's a little bit different, but the barrier to testing it out is low. And then, I mean, when everybody thinks about open source, they think about like, oh, it's this community that, it's not just the company behind it. There's lots of different people that are contributing code, which we think is great in healthcare because usually at least on the data side of healthcare, how it works is like knowledge gets siloed into different institutions. And it's not really, it's like, what's the right way to define this measure? Or what's the right way to process this data to get this sort of concept that ends up mostly living as institutional knowledge within people, within organizations, or within companies that develop this like proprietary way of doing something. And when we were developers at previous companies, my co-founder Coco and I, we just hated that. We wanted the knowledge to be out there in the open so we could test it, see if it worked for us, and then implement it if it did. So it was kind of that ethos that we really liked.
Interesting. It sounds like you're almost describing like the origin of the written word or something like that. That's,
I don't
historical
know if it's that dramatic, but.
And then we wrote our, anyway. Okay, Cody, you're next. Why is open source the right choice?
Yeah, kind of building on what Aaron said, I'll give two answers. One of a more of an idealistic answer and one of a more of a tactical answer. I think, like Aaron was saying, there is this feeling of there's too much siloed data, which ends up leading to lots of redundancies, lots of inefficiencies, because you have many teams who are rebuilding the exact same thing over and over again. And in an environment and an era where there's like thousands of new digital healthcare companies that are being launched each year, it just seems like a kind of dramatic shame that there's so much duplicated effort going on of rebuilding the exact same platforms, the exact same infrastructure. Like how many times are some new company going to go off and rebuild how to represent a patient, how to represent a doctor? So we have this idealistic sense of like, it would be better, it'd be good for the healthcare industry, it'd be good for the world if there were actually like open source tools out there that could make that faster and easier. The tactical answer from running a business perspective is that it's been a massive win for our sales process as well. Like Aaron was saying, it completely changes the conversation when someone can just go download the tool and try it, which it is strikingly different compared to most healthcare incumbents, where if you go to their website and, okay, this looks great, I want to try it, immediately it's like contact sales. There is no try it. There is no free demo. There is no like, I want to look at the code. I want to look at behind the curtain. That is not an option. Open source has completely changed our sales motion. Our GitHub repository is probably our #1 or #2 sales channel for inbound leads for customer development. And it immediately establishes the sense of credibility and authenticity with our potential customers because they can just go audit the code themselves, which just completely changes the conversation.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's almost like a very pragmatic take. I mean, Josh, I'm gonna like ask you, how did DevTools become the right angle for Flexpa? I could just very easily imagine like a SaaS tool like you described, I want to get claims data for this patient, fill in the credential and press like authorize and just, load it into my SaaS tool. Why did you go the developer angle with this product and how do you think about that?
So we started off by trying to build an endpoint solution ourselves. So we wanted to automate the interpretation of pulmonary function test data. So a pulmonary function test is a lung test. And that was interesting to us because we had personal connections to pulmonologists. And we had heard them describe the painful process, manual process of comparing results to normative values. And it all seemed like it could be automated. So being naive and foolhardy, we just tried to start doing that. We approached that problem as developers. So, okay, how do we get data? How do we build a model? What data is actually available? How is it structured? Like, what's the protocol here? Is there a specific format that it's in? And as Cody mentioned, if you start going down this rabbit hole, you quickly get caught up in this, I would describe it as a rat nest of brochureware websites that have really opaque sales processes. Everything leads back to the brochure and the schedule a call button. And it's particularly difficult for a developer to understand this complicated intersection of things that seem like they are internet standards and things that seem like they're the product of regulations. And so when you actually go to get data, even if you manage to untangle this nest and discover FHIR and discover the standards process and discover even open source software that's implementing those standards, a lot of the time that stuff is, the actual data is still institutionally gated. So if you want to do something novel, if you want to contribute to the tools available to a clinician and you're on the outside, good luck. Like, that's a really, really, really hard thing to do. And it's ultimately, it's really hard to just build stuff. It's hard to build anything. And not to get even too picky about particular stacks, but even the language choices involved tend to reflect a much slow and maybe more nascent developer ecosystem. So then we had this kind of aha moment of, well, wait a second, what if we stopped trying to go down the rabbit hole of building a specific endpoint solution ourselves and just focused on the bigger picture problem of building the tools for people who are going to build those things, making it easy, creating a ramp basically for others to come after us and build on top of things that we found really hard to do in the first place.
Completely makes sense. I mean, the brochureware and like non-clarity.
It's always with a header image of someone with some crazy like glass only iPad, like pointing at graphs, and they're really stereotypical.
I mean, can you drill into what you mean by language choices? Like, what did they tell you and what did you learn from the language choices?
Well, I meant that more in the sense of the developer, the common developer criticism, which goes something along the lines of, why is this written in Java? And not to say that there's anything wrong with that. And I think it's important a lot of the time for more, once you mature into a development career, to de-emphasize some of the importance of those things. But from the lens of being in the startup ecosystem and working with certain technology choices and stacks, not having something that I can go and run npm install or pip install on,
Yeah,
I think really limits the number of possible contributors.
totally. There's like a big corollary there, Josh, to like the data analytics side of things too. Like a lot of the publicly available groupers or measures, you can find some of those things already coded on the internet. Guess what language they're written in? SAS. Like the worst statistical language that no one ever wants. Apologies if anybody on the call uses SAS today. I'm actually certified in SAS going back to 2009. I could not write a single line of SAS today. So interesting corollary there.
I mean, this is like a thing in modern software development. Like, you know, the tool chain that you're on and like the other people that are on it kind of is a very important, almost if you're trying to deploy a product, develop a product. It's just critical. Like if you have this heterogeneous environment where you need to like check your Java class path on all your deployment, yeah, it just increases your DevOps surface area. And you need a certain kind of skill set to be able to like manage all of those carefully if you choose to introduce that in your environment. So yeah, completely agree. Like your comment is, can you NPM install it? Like, I don't know if that resonates with the group, but hear that again and again. Perhaps that's this kind of a reasonable time to jump into like the SDLC, for your products. Like, and I asked this one to be kind of brief, as I want to make sure we get a chance to like get to people's questions. But like for each company, and Aaron, we'll start with you. When a developer comes on board, or a customer, let's say, even if they're not a developer, like walk me through their journey. What happens when they're using your product?
Yeah, so for a user to use the Tuva project, there's two basic prerequisites.
Yeah.
One is that they've got healthcare data, like claims or medical record data, in a data warehouse. So data warehouse being Snowflake, BigQuery, Redshift, Postgres, Databricks, something like that. The second prerequisite is that they have DBT. That's that open source data transformation framework I mentioned earlier. If they've got both of those things, how they use the Tuva project is they import it as a package into their DBT project. They do some configuration to map their raw healthcare data to our input layer. It's kind of like the API for the rest of the Tuva project. And then they can just go to the command line and run DBT build, which basically takes all of their raw data and processes it through the Tuva project, and the result is basically a bunch of tables that show up in their data warehouse that are ready for analytics or that are pointing out data quality problems.
Yeah, awesome. And like, about how long does it take them?
It depends on the data that they're mapping. If they want to use just one part of the Tuva project, like let's say they just wanted to build readmission measures, there's only a handful of data elements that they need to map to our input layer to run the readmission measures. So that could be done in a couple of minutes. If they're trying to map all of their claims data to the Tuva project, that could take several hours. It's just a question of like how much are they trying to adopt every part of the project or just kind of one module?
Makes sense. I mean, it sounds like the domain knowledge and data modeling is a big part of the implementation complexity. Yeah. Or what would be the difference between something easy, something more involved. All right, Cody, you're up next. Customer comes on board.
So
what happens?
Yeah, when a customer first encounters Medplum, so Medplum is really intended to be a very central component of your software architecture, which is both a blessing and a curse. It's very, very powerful once it becomes part of that architecture because it really encourages good habits and good hygiene. It is a challenge though, because it's like changing your database. It's not something you do quickly or in a short period of time. So our customer journey typically starts with building understanding, building familiarity, and then building confidence, because it is taking a big bet on our platform. Once there is that kind of activation energy to move forward, it's a lot of data modeling. And as Aaron mentioned, it always starts with the data, understanding how you want to represent data and really wrapping your head around following the best practices for that. From there, we provide a bunch of open source sample apps, which you can kind of choose your own adventure, find the one that represents what you want to do. Is it a patient experience, more of a provider experience? Is it in the clinical environment? Is it more of a lab experience? Take that, start to tweak it and iterate and kind of go from there. And that starts to follow more of your traditional software cycle. But really, it's most of the work is up front, which has a high cost, but high payoffs in the long run.
Makes sense. Josh, how about for your customer? What's their kind of journey like?
So there's two really important things. One is having open documentation that doesn't have a sales funnel, like you can just go and see it. And the other is having a test mode that doesn't require any sales process to use. So being able to use Flexpa in test mode is something that anyone can do. And the combination of those two things is really powerful, because to actually add Flexpa as a data source to your application is in itself really simple. If you have a Node or JavaScript based web application, you can literally npm install Flexpa link, which is our component to get patient authorization, get access to the claims data. And if you don't run on JavaScript, that's fine too. as long as you have a web app of any kind, you can use a script tag to add Flexpa link. So really, really simple to get started. And I think open documentation and having a test mode are a really powerful combination.
That is the key insight. Like there needs to be a test mode. There needs to be a test environment. I think a lot of
you need to be
healthcare
able
apps
to
don't have that.
You need to be able to, I very strongly feel that you need to be able to run this on localhost. You need to be able to run it in development. And that's a sort of core development tools value.
Totally. It's a great answer, really, really useful. So I think, standards we've talked about briefly here, open source dev tools, these often like cluster together when you see them in practice. Operating systems, network, well, they all are classical examples. In healthcare, this is especially true. Like maybe we could start with you again, Josh, given that there's a big standards and regulatory kind of timeliness to your product. Maybe you could talk about like your use of standards and the changes in the regulatory landscape that have kind of enabled your tool.
Well, patient access APIs have really only come about because of reg tech, right? There's a certain element where being forced to do this was a necessary precondition of it existing in the first place.
Yep.
But the reg tech was only made possible by the foundation laid of having smart on FHIR and FHIR itself in place. There needed to be a standard to point to say, here's how we're going to do user authorization and authentication, and here's how we're going to do the API.
Yeah.
And that process, that sort of the shelling point for collaboration that the standards created, is what enabled the reg tech to come in and actually exist. It's what gave the regulators confidence that if this was imposed on the industry, that the health plans would actually be able to do it. So the thing that was confusing to us as initially as outsiders was, how do these things even relate to one another? How does this, the regulation is saying the patient access APIs have to exist, but how do you find them? Where are they? They keep saying that they exist, but that's really opaque, I think, to an outsider.
Yeah. And it definitely is opaque, even to like people who are in the domain. Were you like spelunking around to find them, or?
I mean, that continues to be an interesting part of working in space is identifying the implementations of regulation in the wild.
Yeah.
It's all over the place.
That's really interesting. I think there's so many levels there. Like, okay, there's a new regulation, there's a standard. People are saying they meet the standard, actually finding it in practice is kind of, you see it again and again in healthcare setting. I mean, Cody, you mentioned standards a few times in previous, like, can you recap for us? Like, what's the highest TLDR with regards to standards and Medplum?
Yeah, so actually kind of building on what Josh was just saying there, I agree that standards are not the norm for healthcare. And especially if you go back 10, 15 years, it was very non-standards based. Almost everyone had their proprietary model. All EHRs were relatively proprietary, and they're mostly completely silos and islands that didn't really talk to each other. I think that the regulations were a big leap forward for the interoperability layer. And now we're at the very early days, in my opinion, of seeing it not just at the interop layer, but actually when you have your data at rest, or how you might actually store the primary representation of that data, which becomes a relatively novel way of thinking about it and very uncommon from the traditional vendors. The real advantage there, I mean, certainly if you've ever been at a large healthcare organization, you see the challenges of non-standard data all over the place. And it becomes this basically a fundamental organizational communication challenge. And if you want to like do an analytics on how appointments work, but your representation of appointment types is like an enum of just integers that someone picked out of a hat 10 years ago that no one really knows the origin of, and now it's passed around like tribal knowledge. Okay, but now you introduce a new appointment type, and now this just becomes this shockwave that goes throughout your organization, because all your financial analysts have to completely figure out how to change their pipelines, your operations analytics, like just across the board, it has these ripple effects. When you use standards and you embrace standards from the very beginning, it is a way of future-proofing yourself and insulating yourself from those challenges, so that you have all this headroom without having to do this like massive upheaval. So I think that's really the end game of like the power of standards, that you have this future proofing on top of the kind of tactical benefits of the interop and everything.
Completely makes sense. I mean,
Definitely.
Aaron, you've described like a few standards, maybe 4 if I recall, but maybe in your own words, like how does Tuva relate to standards and kind of benefit and trade-offs?
Yeah, I guess I would mention a couple things. One, on the data access side of things, FHIR as a standard is great. And I agree with Cody, it's still very early days, but it feels like we're moving in the right direction as an industry with that standard. So pretty thankful for that. And then I guess the other thing I would say, more in like the data transformation or getting closer to analytics, you come up against a couple of standards. One is like measure definitions. So like the federal government or different organizations will put out definitions for lots of different measures, and these get updated on some cadence. Readmissions is a good example, or hospital acquired conditions is another example.
You mean like HEDIS measures?
HEDIS is another example that's maintained by NCQA. And these things are kind of a pain to update and are just changing all the time. Terminology is another example. So measures and terminology closer to analytics, where you have different organizations that maintain different terminology sets. Things like, what are all the ICD-10 codes, or LOINC for labs and observation data, or there's lots of different medication terminologies. And if you're building a data platform to do analytics or machine learning from healthcare data, it can just be like it becomes a lot of overhead to keep up with all those evolving standards as they change monthly or annually. So that's another thing we're trying to help data teams with the Tuva project, is as much of those standards that are open source, we're bringing those into the Tuva project. There are unfortunately a lot of healthcare standards, measure definitions, terminology sets that are not open source, and so we can't really do anything about those, but there's quite a few that are open, and so we're bringing those into the Tuva project to make it easier for data teams.
Oh, I think that's a great observation. Like, even if people open source their ontologies, or they're like, these are the ones that we use that are blessed and they're versioned. I think that's a high value. Okay, one last lightning round before we open up for questions. I would love for all 3 panelists to flex a little bit and tell us about some impressive uses of Devtools from within your own company, like that you use yourselves. Share for the group so that they might have some inspo. Maybe Josh, I could start with you.
You mean Devtools that we use
Yes,
for powerful
yes.
effect?
I like how she turned the table on us.
So I don't think I can point to, well, we've used both Medplum and Tuva now to do some cool things. So plug co-panelists for sure. But the highest leverage dev tool that we've gotten a lot of value from in the course of our company it doesn't necessarily have a healthcare angle, but for us it's been a project called Turborepo, which really the simplest way I can describe it is it gives our monorepo superpowers. So we leverage a monorepo to build everything that we do. So from Flexpa.com to the API to literally everything. One repository, one place, one source of truth. And managing that over time has become a real challenge. So for us, a dev tool that has been super, super powerful, I'd say, is Turborepo, as far as giving us high output per team member, high leverage, super useful.
It's a great example. Okay, Cody, you're next.
So just a second endorsement of Turborepo. We just adopted it in the last month or two, and it took our build time from 10 minutes to 2 minutes, which is one of those you just feel like you're reclaiming hours of your life back. It's a pretty magical feeling. Maybe the one I'll lean into, and maybe it's philosophically aligned with the Medplum mentality of take a little bit of pain up front to organize your data and embrace good hygiene up front, and then you can reap the benefits later, is that we have just loaded up our project to the brim with a lot of the static analysis and code hygiene tools. So things like, well, the simplest versions being things like ESLint and Prettier, but then a lot of the higher level ones such as Sonar Cloud, or what's another good example, Codacity, where these tools where they'll go through and you basically get this machine generated code review, which in many cases it accelerates your development process. It gives you a higher sense of confidence in your code, in your development process. When it actually a code review gets to another human developer, then you have eliminated a lot of the noise and the thrash of, oh, you forgot to add a space here, a period here. All of that's taken care of by tooling. So the conversations you can have are more meaningful in nature. So tools that help solidify and just raise the quality bar on your code base every commit along the way, we're big fans of, and we'll load up on any static analysis tool we can find.
Awesome. Aaron?
Cody or Josh, do you guys use GitHub Copilot? Have you tried that?
I don't think I could give it away anymore. Yes, I'm a big fan.
Wow.
And fun fact on that is that you can tell the GitHub Copilot has been trained on FHIR data. And so if you need a sample observation definition, you just type in resource type observation definition, comma, wait for GitHub Copilot to just fill it in for you. So that's another like lower priority, but still magical feeling of the benefits of standards right there.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I hate to beat a dead horse here, but for us, the number one tool has got to be DBT. It stands, if you're not familiar and you're working in a data warehouse, I can't recommend checking it out highly enough. It's DBT. It stands for Data Build Tool. And the short story of what it does is the old way of doing data engineering inside of a data warehouse is like your team just kind of has a mass of SQL files. And they're maybe organize them in some folder structure, but they're just kind of all over the place. DBT brings kind of software engineering best practices to data engineering through version control and testing. And basically it's a framework where you can organize those SQL files and DBT will figure out the right order to execute them in and build all the tables automatically in your data warehouse. So another plug for DBT for me, but it's got the experience you get as a data engineer is like, if you haven't used it to going to use it is basically like, I'm immediately going to switch to using this. And I don't even know what I was doing before for the last 10 years. That was my experience anyways.
I mean, it's amazing how that like testing version control, it's like comes up again and again, right? Like yep. It's always the same. Okay, there's a few questions in the chat. I'm going to start reading them out and then people raise your hands and we can also take some live questions too. So I see Flexpa and other tools are focused on healthcare. Do you provide anything for dental?
So there is an oral profile for oral claims data in Karen Blue Button, which is the FHIR IG that powers patient access to claims data. So there is some interesting things there. The oral profile isn't part of the mandate though. So it's a little bit less universal. And it also, I believe, is in the latest version of the IG. Mm-hmm. So there is, the short answer is sorta. I would love to chat more offline about it.
Aaron or Cody, any kind of dental thoughts?
To the FHIR specs credit, there is full support for almost all of that, and not just. I apologize if my FHIR love is shining through too bright, but they really have thought of everything, and not just dental, but veterinarian care and the whole 9 yards. So it's all in there. It's pretty magical.
Okay, Matt just asks, Aaron mentioned gated data being a big challenge for customers. Can you share about how your customers navigated this challenge?
I can share a little bit on it. It is still pretty tough in healthcare to get access to data, which is why I think API companies like Flexpa are so important. Honestly, a lot of the old model of getting access to data in healthcare is, you sign a contract with a covered entity like a FHIR or a health system, and you sign the BAA and you're great, we got all the legal stuff out of the way, and then you get thrown over the wall to the IT team who does not care about you at all and has lots of things to do. And so they basically ignore you, and then you kind of have to scrape and claw for their attention to try and get them to send you the data that has already been agreed upon. And then they send you the data and it's not the data that you agreed upon. And it's this massive back and forth, right? So that problem is very real. It still exists today. And I think a lot of the organizations that we work with are starting to talk to companies like Flexpa or some of the other health API companies, because that process is so painful. But it's still, in the current state, it's still a necessary evil.
I hear that, like, you kind of, all the agreements can be in place and still take a long time to get any kind of data flowing. But I guess a question for Cody, and this can be related to like Medplum and your experience at One Medical, experiences with customers building a sidecar application that operates with a legacy EHR. And
this is actually a pretty common use case. So many times there is an EHR in place for historical legacy reasons, and it's often providing a lot of the core billing flow, which organizations are particularly reluctant to touch or disrupt. So, but then you want to build some kind of patient experience on top of that, or providing external facing APIs on top of that. And so that has been a relatively common case for us to be that interop bridge layer. And so then we become initially a pass-through, but over time, what we have found is that as data gets centralized and you build up the capacity and the completeness of that data set in a FHIR-based repository, that it can take over and provide many additional use cases because it is more developer friendly, more accessible. I also put in the chat a story of a lab provider where we initially provided most of the interop engine for some of the long tail HL7 interfaces with lab instruments. But then as that data gets concentrated, starts to get filled in, it was a natural choice for providing an external facing API. And then as that data filled up even further, it became a natural choice for an internal workflow engine. So I think the pattern that we've seen over and over is there are a number of these pointy use cases, which can be very, very powerful in solving an acute short-term problem. But as data gets cleaned up, organized, and filled in and populated, that it opens up many interesting possibilities for net new development for internal purposes.
And pretty interesting, like very dense topic for sure. Okay, question from Tim. So commercial open source or open core has its wrinkles in terms of how it scales with product growth. Does being open source in healthcare come with its own additional nuances with regards to licensing, auditing, governance, compliance?
Good question, Tim. Nothing's immediately jumping out to me in terms of like additional problem, like huge roadblocks. I mean, healthcare is different than any other industry in terms of, regulatory and like very high impact, very high, like the stakes are high, right? Because we're talking about people and their lives and health, which is very important to them. So I think it's really a different animal. But at least on the data side, we've thought about this a great deal when we were thinking about, is open source the right model for us? And when we analyzed it, we were like, we don't see anything here that's going to fundamentally prevent us from being able to do this. Obviously, we would love it if CPT wasn't proprietary and they would let us use their terminology, right, and add it to the open source project as an example. That's not possible, but I think there's enough for us to build that we can really make a difference, and the roadblocks aren't enormous.
Fair enough. Cody, you have a comment here?
Yeah, I think that from a strictly technical interpretation of the question, the answer is no. In many cases, it makes everything easier. There is still a culture of fear, for the olds in the room. You may remember that Microsoft had a pretty aggressive anti-open source campaign 20 years ago, which I do think it still lingers on in some circles of fear. We occasionally get questions about, but does that make your application less secure? Which at a technical level, the answer is no. If you follow all of the best practices and you do everything according to the spec, and you believe in cryptography, then you are as secure as everything should be. However, there is still belief in some circles that like security through obscurity is a strategy, or that you have opened yourself up to this certain class of vulnerabilities. So I think occasionally we get resistance, but in almost every case, it has been one that we can navigate through sending resources or educating on best practices. And then beyond that, then it actually makes things much easier. It's easier to share materials, share references with regulators and auditors and compliance organizations. So overall, assuming that you have a high quality engineering culture, I think that it's almost always a net win.
I think an example of that would be the ONC EHR certification, right? If I can just download Medplum, run the test suite, right? Like I can prove that very transparently whether or not these items are in compliance or not. So I think the flip side of it is that being open source means there's more transparency on the quality of the statements that you're actually making, at least with respect to certification of features and functionality. Governance and auditability are maybe a different beast, but those things seem relatively mundane as far as contributor license agreements and those kinds of things being necessary.
I mean, I agree with you, Josh. Open source reduces the chance of vaporware.
Yeah, otherwise it's a trust thing. It's just, well, do we trust the claims being made?
And like you've mentioned previously, like it is actually the claims and the actual functionality are hard to kind of really verify in a meaningful way many times from a developer perspective. Very interesting. I mean, any last questions here? We do have a few minutes left. Does anyone want to raise their hand and talk in their own voice? Perhaps not. Well, first of all, I want to thank everyone for coming today and share some links with you, given that there's a lot of, technical discussion here. I'll link to a few repos. All repos, I think, in general, appreciate stars. So that's there. And here are the links to the websites in question. And please feel free to I'm going to hang on for a few minutes. And, if you have any questions or thoughts or things that you would like to see in a further series and more in depth, we'd love to hear that. I think one of the hopes is that with a crew like this, we would be able to really accelerate development in healthcare due to that compound nature, which, to date has been elusive in some extent. So would love to keep the dialogue open on that. Yazid, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Cody, Aaron, and Joshua. I really enjoyed the talk today. All of the things you mentioned, really been struggling with these questions for years. Why there's no open source healthcare community? Why is there no support for open source projects? And many open source projects, I remember one of them was called Care2X. I was really interested in Care2X and it died in the graveyard, unfortunately. Well, there's a huge gap between proprietary and open source healthcare systems. Is it to do with regulations? No one believed in open source in healthcare. I remember one day I went to a conference to HIMSS and I wrote about myself, open source fan, and everyone was laughing at me. I still believe in open source software, and I have a dream to one day have an EHR open source software for low and middle income countries. And today I was in the university and one of my colleagues asked me, there's no CDS open source libraries on GitHub or on the internet. And I'm still thinking, why isn't there any open source momentum for healthcare? I love Medplum. I love Happy from Smile CDR. I love many open source projects. I wish you all the best in your projects. But why isn't there the momentum enough for open source healthcare?
So I have a thought here. I was working at Y Combinator for some time and working with a lot of commercial open source companies in other domains. And I think there is an interesting kind of paradigm where healthcare applications are really full stack today. Like they're very, they have a UI and business logic and permissions and it's all kind of commingled in a big app. Whereas open source tools like really tend to be headless. There's not like an open source app, that's very popular, that's kind of user facing. And I think that part of like what is happening now is that the primitives are getting unbundled. So the timing is right in order to like allow open source project to have that viability like it does in other domains. I mean, GitLab and Hashi and all HashiCorp are examples of this unbundling that has happened effectively in the DevOps space. And it's like starting to come here. There's of course the 20-year-old projects, 20 plus open source healthcare, which are of a different generation, which are absolutely still in use, which maybe means it's a good idea for all of us to have open source today because it might be, alive in 20 years. But I would say it's the unbundling that is maybe going to be what could unlock open source for healthcare that has previously been challenging.
Totally, that resonates.
All right, well, we are at time. Thank you all so much for coming. And please feel free to reach out to us on the various channels with regards to your implementation dev questions. I think we'd love to have a community and thought partners as we all go on this journey.
Awesome. Thanks, Reshma.
Thanks, Aaron, for coming. Good. Josh
Thanks
and Cody.
so much.
Thanks,
Later,
all.
everyone.
This was great.